Yes, I'm
Where should I look? Look at you.
Look at me.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Eric Halivni and Peleg Levy, and we are sitting with Steven Stulman in Manhattan on November 28th, 2017. Thank you very much. Why don't we start, tell me a little bit about, we're going to be talking about your father.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about your father, where he grew up, his background, just a little bit to kind of set the stage about his own background.
Well, my father was born in the United States, born in New York.
His name was?
His name was Julius Stulman, born in 1906. And his family was not a Zionist family. He had a strong Jewish identity, not much Jewish education. But I didn't grow up hearing anything about Zionism or Weitzman or Herzl and nothing like that in my life. You have to talk about my mother, which is really more crucial in the beginning. My mother was also born in New York in 1905. Her grandfather was a great Hebrew scholar, came from the Ukraine. So her father rebelled, probably, typical situation, probably the old man studied all day, didn't have time for his children. So my grandfather rebelled, became an atheist. So my mother grew up really, in an atheist background and very much wanted to assimilate. And that's what she hoped I would assimilate, only I rebelled, went the other way. In any case, but there was one connection as my mother's family. My mother had a cousin named Emanuel Mohl, M-O-H-L, who went to Harvard and was a civil engineer. And in the 1920s, the Palestine Economic Corporation, where there was Brandeis and Mack, who were developing industry and investments in Israel, sent him over to do some surveying of Israel, potential developments in Israel. And he stayed and became the town planner of Netanya. I don't know if many people know Netanya is named after Nathan Strauss, who was the Macy Strauss. But if you go to Netanya, it has circles and avenues. It's a beautifully designed city, not like Tel Aviv, which just grew. Okay, that was my mother's cousin, Emanuel Mohl, who designed Netanya, and his wife became the secretary to the mayor of it, Ben Ami. Anyway, he was the first, first Zionist Palestinian that I met. We came to visit in the United States. But the connection is that.
Can I take a step back? Your parents were born in
New York.
New York.
Yeah.
And their parents?
From the Ukraine, from Odessa and Kiev.
So they had come.
Came around 1900. Yeah. My grandfather from Odessa, my grandmother from Kiev, both about 1900. But there was another Harvard graduate who went to law school about that time. The name was Joshua Morrison. This I've never seen in any books because he was a lawyer and kept a very low profile, because a lot of these people are doing illegal things. The most might happen, maybe they got fined, they might even go to prison for a little bit. But if you're a lawyer and you got caught, you got disbarred, so your career was gone if you're an American lawyer. So he kept very much in the background. But Josh Morrison, there's no relation, but happened to be contemporary, he went over also for the Palestine Economic Corporation and worked there for a while in the 20s. And so I believe he met my mother's cousin, Emanuel Mohl, and that was a connection how Morrison met my father. They also, in 1948, we were living in Larchmont, New York, and Josh Morrison was living in New York, in Larchmont in 1948. So the connection comes because, this book, The Pledge, which tells the story about Hotel 14 and all the efforts of, the group that Ben Gurion set up to organize arms and munitions to send to Israel in 1948. And there's a story, it's told in there, and it's been told many times. They were loading out munitions in pier in Jersey City. They had gone to Truman and said, there was an American embargo. You couldn't legally send arms to the Middle East. But the British were secretly supplying the Arabs with arms. As a matter of fact, the Haganah, they stole some secret papers from the British, which showed that they were supplying arms to the Arabs, and they gave them to the French embassy, and the French embassy gave them to the American intelligence. So Truman knew about that, and he was furious when he saw the British were supplying arms to the Arabs. So when the American Jews came to him and said, "Look, this isn't fair," and Truman said, "You're right," he said, "I will tell the FBI to look the other way." He said, "You can load out the munitions." He said, "Just don't get it in the newspaper. And I'll tell the FBI to leave you alone." But I can't. But the law prohibits it. So they were secretly loading out his munitions in a pier in Jersey City. And one night, one of the crates dropped and broke open, and it was marked on the outside textile machinery, but inside was TNT. They said enough TNT to blow up Jersey City. And 3 guys were hauled before the judge, who happened to be an Irish judge. And of course, the Irish were sympathetic with we're fighting anybody that's fighting the Jews. So this Irish judge, McGooey, let these guys off. But the point, they had to find another place because the cover was blown in Jersey City. This is where, so they came to Rafi Recanati, who was the American Israel shipping company, the Recanati family, and he was here working on organizing these shipments of arms to Israel, together with Eli Shalit, who was also in the shipping business. Rafi Recanati's lawyer and right-hand man in the shipping business was Josh Morrison. So what I believe was Josh Morrison that told Rafi Recanati that there's a Jew, the only Jew in the New York waterfront in those days, who has a steamship terminal on the East River in New York, which is my father. So Josh Morrison told Recanati to contact my father. So Josh Morrison called my father and said, you told him the problem, and said, "Would you help?" My father said yes. So my father told me he was picked up in the middle of the night at his home in Larchmont. He was blindfolded, driven in the car. He said, "I don't know where I went. I don't know who I saw." He was somebody from Palestine, I believe it was Shalit, who told him the problem, that they had to find a place that was quiet and secretive in the New York side of the river to ship out this arms. So the next day, my father took a car and he drove up and down the Queens Brooklyn waterfront looking for we had a pier, but our pier was very obvious. Our pier is across from 34th Street. It's right out opposite the Empire State Building, highly visible. So it really didn't make sense to do it there because anybody could see it driving up and down the East River Drive. So he found a place in Astoria, Queens, Potts Cove. It's a little inlet. It's just below the Triborough Bridge, okay? And it's very secluded. There was an old abandoned pier. You can't see it from the bridge, and you can't see it from the river, and you can't see it from Manhattan. And so he arranged to get that space and have arms loaded out. He needed then the longshoremen, so he went to the local longshoremen, who were all dominated by the Irish, and he said, "Look, we're fighting the British." So the Irish said, "We're fighting the British, we're in." So the longshoremen came down, and my father came, talked about coming down at midnight with a black bag and paying these guys off in cash. And that's where they loaded out, I don't know, at least 2 ships, I don't know how many shiploads of arms to the Haganah. In this book, all it says is that only got marked here. Oh, okay. It says they were guaranteed bare security all the way from their loading at 2 piers, one that had been leased at Potts Cove at the foot of 9th Street in Astoria. That's all it says. And I've never seen anything writing other about this story. The corroborative evidence I had was when I first came to Israel, my first visit in 1964, one of the first people I became friendly with was a man named David Crone, who was an American, made Aliyah from Baltimore, and he had worked for the Recanatis and Israel Discount Bank and the PEC. And I told him the story, and he said, "You don't have to tell me." He says, "I was the cargo officer on the ship in Astoria that was loaded the munitions." So that was my verification. My father didn't make the story up.
Wow.
And so that's about really all I know about that story.
Your father why did you have What kind of shipping was he doing for?
We had a lumber pier, a pier that handled lumber ships coming from the west coast of the United States and Canada, discharged lumber coming to New York. We had a big outdoor warehouse for lumber distribution, which is...
Why do you think your father was? You said it wasn't a big, not a big Zionist home.
Well, he wasn't other than that involved. I mean, he was very active in a lot of things. In UJA, he was one of the founders of UJA in New York. He was one of the founders of the American Israel Cultural Foundation. He was active in a lot of things, but he wasn't involved in so much in the the Palestinian, in the other side. He was more in terms of Jewish philanthropy here. I was the one that brought him to Israel. He hadn't been to Israel till I came.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I brought him to Israel, or rather, he followed me to Israel.
When was that?
I first came to Israel in 1964.
As just to visit?
Just about to. I always felt that being a Jew was a very central part of who I was, and that the most important thing going on in Jewish life today is Israel. So if you take your Jewish identity seriously in this time, you have to be involved in Israel. So I picked up, that was before 67, before it became popular. I mean, everybody thought I was crazy. My wife was afraid I was going to make Aliyah. My father thought I was nuts. Everybody thought I was crazy. Who goes to Israel? I mean, I just want to go to Israel. The first person I met was Eliezer Livni, was Sippy Livni's father. You know, he said to me, this is a good one for the record. I'll tell you, this is a story for the record. And I was sitting in the backyard with Eliezer Livni. He was one of the founding Zionists. And he said to me, the first thing is stop the UJA. And I almost fell off my chair, because to me the UJA is like our religion, And he said, it's corrupting the country. Because he saw even then, because the government, there was no accountability. The government was taking the UJA money and using it to subsidize, those who they wanted to subsidize, like the religious parties and so forth. It was only much later that the Americans became more active in seeing, in minding accountability how their money was spent. In those days, it was, we sent it over, and he saw that it was corrupting the country. That was a really advanced insight.
How did you meet him? How did you know him?
I read an article that he wrote, and I read an article that it was published in America, and I was very impressed with what he said. So the three people I wanted to meet was Eliezer Livni when I went over there. The other was Rekanati, because I heard about Rekanati, because I wanted to meet his brother, and Daniel. So I talked to Daniel, and he said, I heard you want to become I want to become involved in Israel. I didn't know how to do it, And he said, start with what you know. I was brilliant in start with what you know. So I did. I was in the lumber business. I started exporting lumber to Israel. This last Rosh Hashanah, I went to the Jewish Museum, and they're selling little jars of honey. And the honey comes from kibbutz Hamochad, Ein Harod. Okay? I sold all the wood for the beehives in Ein Harod because typical kibbutzniks, they decided they wanted to go into the aviary business. They wanted to set up an aviary to produce honey. But so they made a research of what wood the bees like, because the aroma of the wood affects with the bees' attraction. And their conclusion was that the wood that the bees had the greatest affinity for was ponderosa pine, which is our specialty. It comes from California. So I sold all the ponderosa pine from California to the kibbutz, and they made beehives and sold them all over Israel and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and the whole Middle East. They saturated so all the wood that I sent over. So now I'm getting the honey back.
Who was the third person?
And the third person was Martin Buber. Okay? And what he said, the same thing. Actually, he said first, and Rekanati said second. I went to Buber because I was a disciple of Buber. Read a lot I was very much impressed by his philosophy and thinking, and read a lot about it, and I wanted to see him. And so I said, how can I, become involved in Israel? My interest was in how do I bring together my peers, our generation of Americans with a generation of our peers in Israel. And anyway, long story, his answer was, you start with what you know. what you know. We start with what you can do. All depends what you can do. What you can do depends on who you are and what you know. So I went back to my hotel room, and I put down a little list. I said, well, who am I and what do I know? I said, I'm an American Jew. And I said, the overall organization representing American Jews is the UJA in those days. I said, I'm a businessman. I said, well, the organization doing business for Americans doing business in Israel was the Palestine Economic Corporation. I said, I'm in the lumber business, okay? I also had a strong layman's interest in science, so I visited the Weizmann Institute. I put down the Weizmann Institute. And I said, I've always learned, whatever you do, keep your eye on the money. So I put down Israel Discount Bank. Okay, within 6 months, I had no strategy, no plans. I just put those three things. UJA, PEC, Weizmann Institute, lumber, and discount bank. Put those three words in a little piece of paper, put it in my pocket. That was all. I went home. Within 6 months, I was on the board of the National Young Leadership Cabinet of the UJA. I was the board of PEC. I was on the board of the Weizmann Institute. I was working for Recanati in the discount bank, and I was selling lumber to Israel. It all just, because if you're open to it, it all comes to you. It's all there. I didn't plan it, but if you're open to it, it's in front of you. If you don't see it, and that's how I got involved.
Wow.
Oh, there's another thing, another story which you put down, which again nobody has written about. I was just looking this up because my father was a very modest man. He never, talked to me. I mean, the only reason, little story, okay. The only reason I know about this, what my father did in this story, the only reason I know this story, it's an interesting sequel. Many years later, in the 1960s, we were selling lumber, and we had a customer named Bert Millwork, and he was going broke. So as collateral for the debt he owed on his lumber, he gave us a mortgage on his property. And then he went broke, and we foreclosed, and we owned the property. So my father and I went over one morning to look at the property that we just acquired, and it was the same property. This property at Potts Cove, because I remember looking at the old abandoned, broken up pier. I said to my father, I wonder if he could bring in ships there. And he said, shh, I did. And then he told me the story. That was the only reason you know this story. We ended up owning the property. And years later, we sold it at a time which was very critical when we really needed the cash. So in a sense, we got a big payback from, world is strange, right, from that. But the other thing that my father didn't talk about, he had gone to India in 1951, spent a couple of months there as a sort of an unofficial advance team for what was his name? Chester Bowles, who later became Secretary of State. And Chester Bowles asked my father to go over and sort of make an economic survey. And my father saw that they had all these houses. They had these little solar heaters in India. So he went back. He found out who's doing research in this. And he came back and he found out the people who are doing research in this were MIT. And through some contacts at MIT, he got a model in the MIT labs of their experimental solar water heater, and he sent it to Israel. And I think this became the model for, who was it? Solar Banet. There's some guy can get all the credit for it. I forgot his name, but I have here. But this is again, he never won any credit for it. But I had it marked here. Sorry. Oh, that's what I was looking for. Here's the. Here's the Pot Cove property.
Can you hold it for the camera?
Can you hold it up for the camera?
Now, there's the Triborough Bridge, and this was the.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now.
Okay. Yes.
What's interesting, if you go over next time you go over the Triborough Bridge, as you're coming off the Triborough Bridge on the Queens side, look off to the right, and you see a big, ugly apartment house there, and you say, what is that? It's the only big building in there, blocks and what is that doing there? That was built at this property because we acquired it. We then sold it to some developer who got some zoning and put this high rise. So this high rise building is really like a monument. That's the Potco place where the Haggadah ships were loaded. It's now a big apartment house. Anyway, I'm sorry, I should have marked this before, but the because there are definitely some references here. Okay. Here's a telegram. Was this dated August 12, 1952? The Stulman Emmerich Lumber Company. Interested to buy the solar trap pilot plant proposed by you to Eliezer Livney. Stop. Agree to terms of payments. Instruct the engineers to effect survey and will inform you of firm selected by us for this survey. Pincus, Minister of Communications. It wasn't Sapir, I don't know who.
אבא של...
Solar energy pilot plant for Mr. Eliezer Livney. Here's the, bill of lading. Okay. So I think this was the model prototype, which is then further developed into.
לא בטוח שעזר ליבני הזה זה... קראו לו איתן ליבני.
Into the solar trap, the solar energy rooftop, which everybody knows. Anyway, little stories.
Wow. Okay, I have a few questions. One is, you mentioned Dewey Stone and Harry Levine. What was your
because when I first became involved with the Weizmann Institute, Dewey Stone was the founding chairman, Harry Levine was the treasurer, Abe Feinberg was the president of the American Committee, and I was the young kid. So I got to know these guys very well. Again, stories that it's on the record, but I'm generally not known that everybody knows the story about the Exodus. Okay, but who put up the money for it? Was Dewey Stone put up most of the money for the Exodus. Everybody knows the story about Eddie Jacobson calling Harry Truman and telling him, you got to see my guy Weizmann. But who put Eddie Jacobson up to it? There were more than one, but Dewey was one of the people who called Eddie Jacobson, because Dewey had just been in Kansas City previously, and then he telephoned Eddie and told him, you got to arrange for Weizmann to see the president, because Dewey was very close to working with Weizmann in the States. They were all, and Harry Levine, worked with Chaim Slavin, and because Harry was an engineer from Worcester, Massachusetts, and smuggled all kinds of information. Well, I'll tell you something that's not on the. This I bet you don't have on the record, because the story, I heard it, okay? That, Chaim Slavin had gotten the plans for I think it was the Thompson submachine gun, okay? And Harry's wife, Leona, smuggled the plans into Israel by putting it in a tampon. You didn't see that in writing?
Did not know that.
Okay, but that's the story I heard. Okay, I was very close to the family. But so they were doing all kinds of things.
Did you ever meet Slavin?
No. And Abe Feinberg, did all kinds of things which he can't talk about. But those guys were. And the whistles, Harry Truman's whistle stop campaign. Uh-huh. That's right. And then when Truman said, nobody thought Truman could win, when he was running. His polls were down, but he said, I can win if I can get to the people, but if I could go around the country on a train, but I don't have the money. And Abe said, I'll raise the money. Everybody thought he was crazy. They raised $100,000 for Truman's whistle stop campaign.
Did you know Teddy Kollek at all?
I knew Teddy Kollek, yeah. Later on, the Jerusalem Foundation. Yeah.
Later on, but not did your father know any?
No, my father didn't know. He was not.
He just did that one.
He just did that one thing. They asked him to do the thing. Other than that, he came. There was a different. There was the few that did things, but for most American Jewish businessmen, it was you work and you write the check. You go to the UJA and you make your pledge, and that was it. Most of them he didn't personally get involved. He was looked at more like philanthropy, but he didn't personally get involved. Other than this interest, because they asked him. Other than when they asked him.
Do you know the name Millstone from St. Louis? Does that name ring?
No.
Who was the head of?
There was Irv Norrie from Rochester. Irving Norrie was very active.
Who was the head of UJA when you were?
I guess it was Dewey Stone. Dewey Stone was head of UJA also about that
And
time.
who was the executive director?
And Herb Friedman.
Herb Friedman?
Yeah, well, I got involved. That was a fantastic group of young American guys. The National Young Leadership Cabinet was an amazing group. Yeah, I mean, they all. Gordy Zacks, who later became chairman of the UJA, Irvin Fields, Herschel Blumberg, Ivan Novick. All these guys went on to be, but Herb Friedman was very perceptive when he was. He says you guys can't all become leaders of the UJA. He says become leaders of the American whatever organization you want to do is fine. Become leaders. So one of the projects we had was to place our guys in various organizations. So I got involved with the Weitzman, and then so after I went to this first meeting in Chicago, which blew my mind, there was only one other New Yorker there. Only two guys from New York, because New York was very separate from National UJ. UJ New York was an entirely separate entity. And so Mel Dubin and I were out there, and the speaker was Abe Harmon, who was president of, that time president of Hebrew University, ambassador to the United States. And Mel and I drove to the airport in Chicago with Abe Harmon, who had been the speaker there. And Mel and I are talking about this great group. We should have something like that in New York. So Abe turns to us and says, "Why don't you guys do it?" So on the plane ride from Chicago to New York, Mel and I decided we could organize a young leadership group in New York, which we did. We founded the Young Leadership Council in New York City, which was a kind of counterpart of the National UJA.
Leonard Sherman, do you know that name?
No.
Okay.
Lenny Bell, it was right.
Tell me a little bit about Herb Friedman. A little bit more about.
Oh, he was fantastic. He was a fantastic guy. Yeah, he was really very charismatic, dynamic. I mean, we all loved Herb. Was our guru, and we loved Herb. Kind of went off the deep end at the end, but later life he became really a guru with a long hair and everything. But in those days, but he was a rabbi. He went to Yale, and as I did, and
in 48, after the war, he was involved in. He went to the DP camps and.
Right.
I think he was involved in that stuff also.
Yeah, and he organized, and his idea was, let's take the next generation, the next generation of all these Jewish leaders around the country. Let's educate them to be the next generation. So we got, young guys young leaders from all over the country, about 100 of us. And we had missions to Israel, and we had conferences and discussions and meetings and heard lectures, and we really got an education. And most of these guys became leaders in their own community. It was a terrific era. Shame it's sort of.
Gordy Zacks also was.
Gordy Zacks was the chair of the. First was Lenny Bell. First one I forget his name. Is a guy from Florida, but second chairman of the Leadership Council with Lenny Bell, and then it was Gordy Zacks. And that's when I was I'm talking 66, 67, 68. I don't know. Okay. And then what I did after you got me talking. So then right after the 67 war, Golda organized the first prime minister's conference, which was supposed to be to get businessmen from all over the world to go to Jerusalem. So I saw you're going to get all these old guys going to come to Jerusalem. Fine. I said, what about the younger generation? I said, maybe we should have something similar. So I wrote a letter to the prime minister, and I said, why don't we have a young leadership conference at the same time? I get a letter back from Jackie Herzog. That was Chaim's brother, who was a brilliant guy. He died young. He was the brilliant guy, who was the Director General of the Prime Minister's office. So Jackie Herzog, Yaakov, writes me a letter back and said, we think it's a wonderful idea, we're going to give you $25,000 and an Israeli army colonel as your liaison. Can you believe that?
Wow.
Okay. So I went over, and not only that, they said, you pick the Americans, and we will pick young leaders from all around the world through our embassies. And the Prime Minister's office contacted every Israeli embassy, I mean, from Costa Rica to London, okay? And said, send over some young leaders. You pick the young leaders, send them over to the conference. And we had 100 guys, and I had the conference at the Weizmann grounds because they just introduced Weizmann. And it was unbelievable, fantastic. And a lot of those guys then became subsequently involved, like Murray Koffler, who then became chairman of the Federation in Canada and chairman of the Weizmann Institute. But his first meeting was in the first Israeli conference was in with the young leadership. So that was a fantastic time. That was 60, 67, 68. Yeah, I was right after the war.
Which prime ministers did you get a chance to meet?
Well, I heard Ben Gurion speak here. Heard him once speak, and he said in New York, and he said, his stick was, send over 10,000 Americans and we'll change the country. And he was absolutely right. Only we didn't come. The wrong people came. Okay, but we didn't come. I met Golda several times. I met Eshkol several times. And I met Perez, I guess, yeah. And the one that's closest to was Katsir, Ephraim, because he was the Weizmann Institute professor. I mean, I was a friend. I mean, Kachalski and I were friends, yeah. Ephraim, Katsir, Kachalski. Remember, I set up when his brother was massacred by the Japanese terrorist in the Lud airport. His brother was a wonderful guy. I set up a lectureship, annual lectureship which is still going, in his name at the Weizmann Institute.
Are you still involved in Weizmann?
Not really. I'm kind of emeritus now. No, my thing now is something different. It's a long way from 1948, but
yeah.
Well, I think what my Israeli friends tell me, which I believe, the most important challenge facing Israel is internal, domestic, and it's the question is what kind of state is Israel going to be? Because again, the dream of the 1948 Zionists around the world was to create a democratic Jewish state. But nobody knows what that looks like. There's no such thing ever existed, democratic Jewish state. So we're trying to figure out what it is. We all thought it was going in the right direction, but in recent years, symptomatic of the polarization all over the world, the extremes are dominating. So you have the extreme right and the extreme left. The extreme right in Israel is very concerned to have a Jewish state, but doesn't care or know much about or think much about being a democratic state. The extreme right, the extreme left wants a democratic state, but doesn't know or care much about Judaism. That's their stuff. So, and the center, which is more than half the country, doesn't have an agenda and doesn't have leadership. The right and the left have strong agendas and strong leaderships. So what the fear is that in the next 10 years, and what my Israeli friends tell me, okay, I'm not just sitting here pontificating, my Israeli friends tell me, they're worried in the next 10 years, we'll have to make a choice between a Jewish state or a democratic state. And neither choice is good. We don't want a democratic state which is not Jewish. You don't want a Jewish state which is not democratic. So how do you create a Jewish democratic state? It has to be some concept of Judaism which is democratic. There has to be some concept of Judaism which is not American reforming, imported Anglo-Saxon Judaism, which never took, and not the ultra-Orthodox, ultra-nationalist religion of the right, which has become so politicized that most Israelis say, that's Judaism, I don't want any part about it because I don't like their politics. So you got half the country that they're Jews, but they don't know anything about the Jewish heritage. So what I've been trying to help facilitate is the emergence of a new Israeli Judaism, a new authentic, passionate, meaningful, relevant, non-denominational, egalitarian, democratic.
So through which body?
So we've been doing this as a grassroots movement, because I think one of the big mistakes that most American organizations do is they think they want to change everything from the top. They want to pressure the government, they want to lobby the Knesset, they want to, okay? What they forget is Israel is a real democracy, which means that the only people that are going to change things in Israel are the Israeli people, and we neglect the Israeli people. So what we're doing is encouraging a grassroots movement of the people, not trying to change, laws or government rules. And the idea is to encourage various communities around the country who want to do their own thing, who want to create authentic Jewish community. That's the key word everybody wants, because in becoming a socialist state and in giving up their Judaism, they threw out community, because they have no Jewish. They don't have a Jewish community, and all the things that traditional diaspora Jewish communities do, like caring for the sick and the poor and the elderly and education and Hevra Kaddish and everything. The government does that, So I'm not engaged in anything that's Jewish, okay? So what do? I mean, Yom Kippur is Bicycle Day in Tel Aviv. So the number of people, all the way from secular Tel Avivians to secular kibbutznik and then the kibbutznik in the north, say, hey, maybe we threw out the baby with the bathwater, that we went so far away from tradition that we lost something, and we try to find a way now to reconnect with our Jewish heritage. But it has to be an authentically Israeli way, okay? And it has to be, we have to find ways to create our own ways of reconnecting with our Jewish heritage. So there are various groups. The most highly visible is in Tel Aviv. You may have heard of they call it the Kabbalat Shabbat on the port, Beit Tfilah Israeli, which is a community. You know about that. So every Friday night they have 1,200 people. The Kabbalat Shabbat overlooking the port. They had the largest sukkah in Israel, or maybe in the world, a few weeks ago. They clocked in 40,000 people came to the sukkah. Including, Arabs, Kabadniks, B'nai Barak, everybody can come to Sukkah. It's an international holiday. I can show you, we have another community up in Nahalal, which is the first Moshav, which is a very different kind of world. But they sent me a picture. In their Sukkah, I have a photograph of one of the neighboring Arabs, and he's on his knees praying in the Sukkah. I sent it to my rabbi. He said, the Mashiach's coming. I mean, so all kinds of things are happening around the country, but they're not yet visible. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's...
How do you think the fact that your father was involved in these things, how did that impact you, or the way that you view Israel, or how did that impact your approach?
My father and I are very different. He was a fantastic. I mean, I can tell you, he's worth a whole week of interviews. Okay, he was an extraordinary man. Did some extraordinary things, but on a personality basis, he was very difficult. He had so. I influenced him in terms of Israel. I influenced him. I got him he came to Israel because of me and got involved with things. Okay, I became involved in Israel more because of my own inner inclinations, of which I think was something from the inside that I inherited. Or yes, what he did do, he did one crucial thing, which that was I don't think I mentioned this, but. When I was, did I mention about my bar mitzvah? No, because I was talking about it at lunch to someone, so I got confused a little bit. So my mother sent me off to boarding school, hoping I'd become assimilated. Okay? But then my father had guilt feelings, and he felt, that I should have a bar mitzvah. So and the only time I was away at school was the only time we could do it in the summer, and we spent the summers out in New Jersey, in near Long Branch, New Jersey. And he hired a teacher to teach me bar mitzvah lessons so I could have a bar mitzvah at the end of the summer. I had an 8-week cram course. And my teacher was an Orthodox Jew, because it was a synagogue and Orthodox shul in Long Branch, and he was the Malamed, he was the Hebrew teacher. And he would say, He was not Hasid, but he was an Orthodox Jew, escaped from the Tsar's army, came to America, and raised a family, although the typical only in America story. But he was not a rabbi. He was not a rabbi. And all my friends were being turned off by their rabbis, because the rabbis, part of the bar mitzvah, they say, well, you got to do this, you got to do that, you commit to this, you commit to that. He never asked me anything, what I did, what I ate, what I did, what I observed. It was all, come for Shabbos and let's sing and let's enjoy, let's discuss. Well, his idea of discussing, we discuss the Babylonians and the Syrians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans while they're all gone and we're still here, And he never been to Israel, but he always thought of Eretz Israel. And he, I think, imbued in me a love of Eretz Israel from my teacher. So I think I really got it from my teacher. And I loved it because he exposed me to a whole world of Yiddishkeit, of Jewish life, with love and passion, which I'd never been exposed to at home. And from then on, I decided that I studied on my own. And on my own, then I found Buber and all that. But it was really stimulated, not by my father, but by my bar mitzvah teacher. And the unusual part is because most people went the other way, and this guy turned me on. So I said, I was fortunate.
Why do you think it's important for people to hear these stories about Americans involved or the contribution of American Jews toward Israel?
Well, unfortunately, too many young Israelis today don't know. Nobody knows history. Americans don't know history. They don't know their history, and they think, Israel, we did it, and look what we did, and we can survive on our own. We don't need the rest of the world. And they don't know that if it wasn't for the diaspora, it wasn't for the British and American Jewish community, I don't think Israel would exist. I mean, all the way from the, from the Balfour Declaration, from Truman recognizing Israel, from the guns, from the planes that were sent over, that were flown by Americans. I heard a story the other day, which has just been documented. You may not know, the magic carpet bringing the Yemenite Jews to Israel. You know who flew the planes? Gentile pilots from Alaska Airlines. They never talked about it because it was illegal. They could have lost. So it goes to the point of this. When Gordy Zacks was chairman of the National Young Leadership Council, and he had heard about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he wanted to meet the Rebbe. So my father had sponsored the Rebbe coming to America. That's a whole other story. There's books about that. My father sponsored the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe and his family, to come to America. Anyway, so I arranged for Gordy to go meet the Rebbe. And I was there, and Gordy came out of the room. And Gordy was usually when he's a super salesman, constantly talking. And he was totally speechless. He said, first of all, he said, his eyes, he looked right through me. He knew everything. He said, the Rebbe said to me one thing. He said, I know who you are, and I know what you're doing, and I think it's wonderful. He said, but do your children know why you're doing this? And if they don't, what makes you think they will continue? And Gordy said that turned my world upside down. Because in our young leadership cabinet, as I said in this sense, our religion was philanthropy. Our church was the UJA. Our program was Zionism. One thing we never mentioned was God. In other words, why are we doing this? It was taken for granted, our generation, taken for granted because we remembered the Holocaust and we grew up with anti-Semitism. That's why we were doing it, okay? But you can't tell your kids, I'm doing this because what happened to me when I was a boy, or I'm doing this because what happened to your grandfather when he was a boy. They'll say, okay, Papa, that's ancient history. You're doing that, I'm interested in the art museum. I'm interested in the opera. You do Israel, you do philanthropy. You got your thing, I got my thing. It's not enough to say I'm doing it because, you have to say, no, you're doing it because this is what Jews do. This is what Jews do. And what we never talked about is, is doing it as Jews, because this is This is what Judaism is all about. And that's what the Rebbe hit his finger on. So Gordy came back and he started keeping Friday night. And his daughter now runs the Tali schools in Israel. So I guess it worked. But there was but today, this is where we got a big problem. I know with my kids, we're all, the big problem is not, it's not the anti-Israel, it's not the extremes. The big problem is the kids in the middle who said, I don't understand, it's already confusing, I don't know, I don't want to be involved, it's a big problem, who cares? I don't need Israel. And so the Americans say, I don't need Israel, and the Israelis say we don't need America, and that's a sure prescription for disaster.
What was the story with your father and the Rebbe?
Well, again, the same thing. My father, somebody asked him to do it. My father's lawyer, real estate lawyer, was a man named Sam Kramer, who had come from a Lubavitch family. I'm talking in the 1940s. There were only a handful of Lubavitchers in New York, just a few, okay? And they went, and the Rebbe, that's the previous Rebbe, they were trapped in Warsaw. And the Lubavitchers wanted to get them out. One thing the Lubavitchers have always been good at, going back to the 18th century when they, in the famous story, when the Rebbe was arrested by the Tsar, and the Lubavitchers always knew how to use the political system. They're very worldly, sophisticated people in that sense. So they had contacts with, with Sam Rosenman, with the Secretary of Treasury, with Morgenthau, and so forth. So Sam Kramer said, so they went to the Secretary of State, Morgenthau, whose wife's grandfather happens to be Jewish. Some people knew that. Anyway, they went to Morgenthau and they said, Cordell Hull. I'm going to be a senior. Cordell Hull, Morgenthau was Secretary of Treasury. Cordell Hull, the old Southerner, was the Secretary of State. It was Cordell Hull's wife who was a Jewish grandfather. They went to Cordell Hull, and they said, look, frankly, we know the administration isn't doing much for the Jews, but we got one Jewish rabbi who's like the Pope of the Jews. You see, if you get this big one out, this is, at least you could say you did something. Good for points. Get one Jewish rabbi out. And Hull bought it, and he bought it. And it was little known that this was 1940, before the United States was in the war. So the war was on in Europe, but the United States was still neutral. So we still had some contacts with Germany. And the Secretary of State had contacts with Admiral Canaris, who was head of the German counterintelligence. Admiral Canaris came from an old aristocratic German family. He was a staunch German patriot, but he was not a Nazi. He didn't like Hitler, okay? And Hull came to Canaris and said, I want a favor. There's a rabbi in Warsaw. We want to get out the country. And he's going to help us by doing a favor. And Canaris said, it wouldn't be a bad thing if he said, I did a favor for the Americans, they owe me one, And he wasn't a Nazi, so the Jewish thing didn't bother him. So Admiral Canaris and his agents spirited out the Rebbe and his family under the eyes of the SS. Okay, had to secretly get them out by train from Warsaw to Berlin, and then from Berlin up into Sweden, where they eventually got a boat to the United States. But in order to get that, so this was going on. But in order to get to the United States, they had to have a sponsor. They had to be sponsored. That somebody say that was under the law. Somebody to say that you won't be a burden on the society. Somewhere that with means that put up a voucher for you. Okay, so Sam Kramer was my father's lawyer. Came to my father and said, "Would you help sponsor the Rebbe?" I didn't know who the Rebbe was, but Sam asked him. He said, "This is a big." So my father did it. Put up the papers. It's all documented in the book for the Rebbe and all his family to come to the United States. And my father became very close to the Rebbe, became the main supporter of Lubavitch back in the early years, and became really like a spiritual son to the previous Rebbe. With the late Rebbe, he was more like a brother. They would constantly argue back and forth, but the previous Rebbe was my father's spiritual father. The difference between the late Rebbe and my father, I mean, I have correspondence there, I have books like this, letters between the two, that my father was trying to save. My father was an idealist. He was a very practical man, but he was also an idealist. He wanted to save the world, okay? He wanted to save the world. The Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, well, that's all fine, but meanwhile the house is burning, okay? You save the Jewish people first. And my father would always say, the Rebbe is not wrong. The Rebbe is not wrong. They're both right. But anyway, that was the two of them would go back and forth between saving the world and saving the Jewish people.
Do you by chance have a picture of your father?
Yeah.
Well, one second.
Oh yeah, I'm here in the.
Okay.
Okay. Hi.
Say it again, please.
The Rebbe in the Third Reich was the book. I forget the name. It was published by Yale University Press, written by an American historian.
Oh, just a minute.
יש לך עוד שאלות? All right. This was really fascinating. No, this is stories that
stories that just come out, yeah. But so yeah, who else who's around? A guy named David Ginsberg in Washington. I don't know if he's still around. Lawyer David Ginsberg.
Yeah. What was his?
Again, he was in the inside a lot. He's an inside a lot of this stuff. David, Ginsburg. I hadn't heard that he died. David, he's a lawyer, very prominent lawyer in Washington, and he was the lawyer for the American Pay for Weitzman. He was the contact between a lot of these activities and Congress, because a lot of these southern bastard, the Southerners controlled Congress, and I mean for the liberal Northerners it was basically understanding, but for these Southerners it was just, they didn't give a shit about Israel. It was just money. But David Ginsberg was knew a lot of this stuff.
Did you know Rudolf Sonneborn?
I don't know. No, I don't know if he was involved in that. No, that was.
Did you know him?
No.
Okay.
I think I met one of them.
Maybe. Do you remember?
There was a guy named Zimmer Resnick from Astoria, from Asbury Park. He was. I met him.
I want to ask. Do you remember as a child the vote in '47?
I'll tell you when I became a Zionist. I tell you when the moment I became a Zionist. The first, not that vote. There was an earlier vote, in which partition there was it was a first vote, and maybe it was a preliminary vote, and it was turned down. And I was on the subway. I remember I was buying chemicals downtown from my chemistry set, and I was on the subway coming home, and I see in the Daily News that the UN rejects the Palestine partition. I started to cry, and I came home to my father, and I came to the door, and I threw my arms around and hugged him. He said, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" I said, "Did you see what they did to us? Us. I said, us."
Oh. Wow.
Then I realized I was a Zionist.
How old were you?
So I was 16, 1940s, 47, 16, 17. But that's when I became a Zionist, when I realized that's us.
Oh, that's nice.
That's a great story. Okay.
Okay.
Fantastic.
In Israel. And then he went to Ben Gurion and said, "I'm going to bring Coca-Cola to Israel, but on one condition. you don't let PepsiCo in for 20 years. And why do you think you were, I mean, if you were growing up in Israel, you had Coke, you never had Pepsi.
Yeah,
Where was Pepsi?
Absolutely.
That was the deal.
Until the 90s.
That was the deal. Abe, you don't let Pepsi in.
Yeah.
And then, it's like, Abe, I loved Abe. Abe was, okay, this is the kind of guy Abe was. So Abe made a lot of money in Coca-Cola, very profitable. So that money, he took that money and then he gave it away to charity and wanted his names on everything. And I remember the government said, I don't know, was it Golda said, you know, that's not right. You don't make money in Israel. You bring money to Israel. He said, "What's the thing? I'm making money in Israel. I'm giving that money away." They didn't understand it. That he was making money. He was making Coca-Cola was very profitable. But that was a.
The Musiverta.
Okay, so this was again another typical Abe story. So he. Then he had a company, his company is a stocking business, Kaiser Roth. Kaiser Roth is going to go public, okay? So he goes to Louis Stulman, chairman of the White Institute. He says, my stock is going to go public. I can't buy it, and you can't buy it. It's insider information. But he said, if the American Committee for the Weizmann Institute buys it, I will guarantee that they don't lose any money. And the American Committee bought the stock, made money. And then Abe said, okay, you made money, now I want my name at the graduate school. And today it's the Feinberg Graduate School. He didn't put any money up, but he did. He gave him a promise that they wouldn't lose money on his stock. That was Abe. And it's the Feinberg Graduate School. I mean, there was a different world in those days.
Wow.
The people today don't understand the way people wheeled and dealed. But they did great things for Israel.